So, a very warm welcome to everyone who joins us today for this event. My name is Father Dragoș Herescu. I'm the principal of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies, and I am delighted to see so many of you attending this event today, the book launch of Father Nikolaos Loudovikos' latest book and fruit of research. I am equally delighted to have Father Nikolaos back with us at the Institute. Father Nikolaos has been a long-standing friend and collaborator of the Institute. It's always a privilege to have him with us.
Thank you.
Christoph will properly introduce Father Nikolaos in a moment. I will only make demands on your attention for just a few more seconds as I share with you some of the other events and developments at the Institute in the coming period. So the Institute is having a very busy spring, and we're going to continue with events, conferences, and activities as we continue to work mainly online, but we'll have events throughout the summer, the spring, and all the way up until September and October. We continue our series of IOCS conversation days in 2021 with some exciting events. Next week, we have a special edition of the lockdown conversation events, which were an offshoot of the wider conversation days. We have a lockdown conversation with His Eminence Archbishop Angelos of the Coptic Orthodox Church, and it takes place on Thursday, the 11th of March. So feel very welcome to book that in your diaries. I think you would want to join that event very much. The IOCS Conversation Days continue also with an event at the end of March, on the 25th of March. We have Father Alexander Taft and Father Patrick Ramsey in conversation on the topic of the Church in the context of theotic relationships. And also on the 15th of April, well into Lent, the Orthodox Lent, we have a very appropriate conversation day on the topic of spiritual guidance, when we have Father Liviu Barbu and Father Demetrios Batrelos in conversation. So again, please make a note of that date. Lastly, as I said, delighted as we are that Father Nikolaos is with us today, and we're hosting this book launch. This is the first of 3 book launches that the Institute is organizing or hosting this year. We're going to have a second one sometime at the end of May, early June. We're waiting for some development and news from the publishers of that book. And we will have Father John Binns presenting and sharing with us his book on the history of monasticism. And then sometime in October, on the 8th of October, we will have a third book launch by 2 American psychotherapists and people working in this field on the topic of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Eastern Orthodox Christian anthropology. And again, I think that would be a very relevant book launch. Thanking you for bearing with me as I made these announcements at the beginning. I now hand over to Christoph to introduce Father Nikolaos, and I hope we all learn something important from today's book launch and having heard Father Nikolaos a bit later. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So my name is Christoph Schneider. I'm the academic director of the Institute. Let me say a few words about what we would like to do this evening. First and foremost, of course, we'd like to give Father Nikolaos an opportunity to present his book, and we'll do that in the form of a dialogue. Prepared some questions, and Father Nikolaos will answer this question. Then we'll have a short break, and after the break, everyone is invited to ask questions, if you still have the energy, because as we all know, Zoom meetings can be quite tiring. Now, please keep in mind that this is a book launch, it's not a colloquium, so we don't presuppose that everyone has read the book. from beginning to end. So the questions I've prepared have more of a general character. So you should be able to follow the conversation and the dialogue, even if you haven't read the book. Now, this book is extremely rich and will only be able to discuss, touch upon the main ideas. So if you want to study the book in detail, you have to order it, and we will circulate an order form provided by the publisher in the chat box. And if you order the book with this form, you'll get a 25% discount, but you have to act quickly because the special offer expires on the 15th of March. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce Father Nikolaos Loudovikos. He is a professor of dogmatics and Christian philosophy at the University Ecclesiastical Academy of Thessaloniki in Greece. He's also a visiting professor at our institute here in Cambridge, and also one of the co-founders of our institute, so we have to keep that in mind. Furthermore, he's a research fellow at the University of Winchester, and is the author of 12 books on systematic and philosophical theology, has written numerous articles, and I would like particularly mention the English translations that have appeared. Unfortunately, not all of his books have been translated into English yet, but the ones that are available, apart from Analogical Identities, are Church in the Making, an apophatic Ecclesiology of Consubstantiality, and a Eucharistic Ontology, Maximus the Confessor's Eschatological Ontology of Being, as Dialogical Reciprocity. And I think there is a fourth book about to appear in the next weeks. Father Nikolaos, is that correct?
You mean in English or in Greek?
In English, yeah, in English.
No, not in some days. I think it's in some months. It's the second volume on this one. I mean, yeah.
Okay, in some months.
Yeah.
Excellent. Furthermore, Father Nikolaos is also senior editor of the recently established journal Analogia, the Pantheia Journal of Theological Studies. And I can say, without any question, that Father Nikolaos is one of the most profound and most prolific Orthodox theologians in the world. There's no question about it. So before we start our conversation, I would like to make 3 points about the book. When you read Analogical Identities, you will meet a wealth of historical information about pre-Christian Greek philosophy, patristic and medieval theology and philosophy in the Greek East and the Latin West. And because of this historical aspect of this book was published in the series Studia Traditione Theologiae, Explorations in Early and Medieval Theology. However, this is by no means just a historical study, because, and that's the second point, the book also makes a significant contribution to the ecumenical debate. Of course, the book was written by an Orthodox theologian, but it's not, the usual anti-Western polemics, but the publication makes a constructive contribution to the dialogue between East and West, including, I think, the Protestant tradition. Father Nikolaos also engages with Protestant thinkers. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, Father Nikolaos gives an outline of a philosophy and theology of the self, and he engages with modern and postmodern philosophy. There's a very long list of thinkers that he discusses in the book, to name just a few, like Martin Buber's personalism, Levinas, Nietzsche recur, then German idealism, and not to forget other Orthodox theologians like John Sisioulas and Jan Arras. Okay, it's now time to start our conversation with Father Nikolaos so that we can look at some of these questions in more detail. as you must have noticed, this book has a very interesting title. So the main title is Analogical Identities, the Creation of the Christian Self. And then the subtitle reads, Beyond Spirituality and Mysticism in the Patristic Era. And that's, of course, very interesting because many people feel attracted to orthodoxy because of its spirituality and mysticism. You know, orthodoxy is spiritual and mystical, perhaps as opposed to austere Calvinism. So why did you, Father, why did you choose this title? Why do we need to go beyond spirituality and mysticism?
Yeah, Christoph, thank you. Look, I was attracted to Orthodoxy. I was baptized Orthodox, but I was an atheist. I was a psychoanalyst who switched to philosophy, and then, after all, became a theologian and turned to theology. But I was attracted precisely because of the opposite. I mean, in a sense, I could find spirituality and mysticism in many other places. And I did so. I was, in my youth, I wrote a dissertation on Plotinus and a philosophical dissertation. And I realized that we don't, what is spirituality can be destructive for human beings. And also as a former psychoanalyst, I knew that you cannot deal with your unconscious if you want to escape this unconscious. And then it follows you all the time and it becomes your destiny. So it's, you know, it's absolutely contaminating. The spirituality is contaminating. Because we are talking of books, I finished a book in Greek a couple of days ago. This is the good side of the quarantine, and entitled Unseen Harmony. The subtitle is Metaphysical History of Ancient Greek Philosophy. That is in Greek. I hope that someday it will be translated, but for the moment, yes, it's only Greek, in Greek. I mean, it is important for me to note two things. First, that the ancient world was so deeply impressed by Platonism, scared of, perhaps I can say, for Platonism. After the pre-Socratics, Plato opened a wonderful, you know, perspective. Orphism became a philosophy and an ontology at the same time. But all this wonderful perspective created problems first of all to Plato himself, when he realized that the one does not care about us, cannot get in communion with us. We cannot get in communion with it. So he turned to be, became finally a political philosopher in order to cope with this lack. Metaphysics, Greek metaphysics is a great lack. At the end of the day, it's something that lacks all the time. And of course, we see the schools that followed Plato, such as, for example, Epicurus, first of all, to deal with not with metaphysics anymore, but to how to find his serenity and how to get in friendship with the real beings and how to find a little pleasure as a human being and how not to afraid gods, not to afraid death. And then we have the Stoicism, which are wonderful. Of course, we had, first of all, Aristotle, which is a Platonist in revolt in somehow, in a sense, and that and he tries all the time to find the truth within beings. And soul is a part of this truth. It is the entelechia of the human body. And we have to somehow switch to real beings as they are now in time and space. And, you know, and even the metaphysics has to deal with the ousia prota, the first essence, I mean, the concrete human being, first of all, and then the idea of human, which is precisely the opposite of what Plato did. And then the Epicurus, and then the Stoicism. Somehow, it's again an effort to find the logos of being within the world, not outside of the world. But, Platonism was the last word of Hellenism. Despite of all this, protections, of all these protests, for this philosophical Protestantism, if I'm allowed to say this. I mean, we conclude with Plotinus. And Plotinus is great, Plotinus is fascinating, Plotinus is absolutely attractive because you are getting rid of everything that bothers you, everything that belongs to your lower soul, with the desires and with the sentiments and with women who are full of sentiments and desire, and with sexual love and with all those terrible things that distract you. And finally, in an imaginary way, I speak as a psychoanalyst here, he dreams in the last Ennead of the perfect union of the ego with the one. He dreams of it because the one does not speak. There's not dialogical reciprocity between them. So you imagine that you've got the one, you have the one, you are the one, you are the one. And ampho in Greek, one, the two are one, the two are one. So yes, we have much spirituality to deal with in Hellenism. And I repeat that was the last word. That means that we needed this, and we still need this, of course. Humankind needs much spirituality in order to somehow avoid the depression. And of course, there's also mysticism. I'm coping. I mean, the quoting from the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy. Mysticism is a doctrine or discipline, maintaining that one can gain knowledge of reality that is not accessible to sense perception or to rational conceptual thought. When I read it as with the eyes of a former psychoanalyst, I thought that the unconscious is such a knowledge precisely. my problem when I approached Christianity was precisely if we can transform the senses, if we can transform the body, if we can transform our minds, and not just to follow them in a more mystical, that means unconscious, and dangerous, because it is, somehow surrendered to some absolutely, dangerous monsters which dwell in the basement of our existence. Okay. So in a sense, that's one of the reasons. I mean, I was not attracted by mysticism and spirituality, but of the possibility of a real transformation of human being in order to become an eternal psychosomatic being. Okay, in a sense, in order to, and of course, Maximus comes here, the confessor says, incarnation, first of all, is an affirmation of the material creation, first of all, and material self. Okay, that means, and then he opens a way of transformation of mode of existence. Okay, it's not the only one, but I think that I have somehow answered your question. I mean, for me, Christianity is about what is beyond spirituality and mysticism.
Thank you very much, Father. So in your book, you reflect on different understandings of the Christian self, and you distinguish between two main types that correspond to different Trinitarian metaphysics. Could you give us a brief account of the main features of these two types? So in the book, if you haven't read the book, Father Nikolaos distinguishes between type A and type B self. And so the type B self is mainly represented by Augustine and Origen. And the type A self is represented by Maximus, Simon the New Theologian, and Gregory Palamas. So Father, could you give us a brief outline of what the difference between these two types consists in?
First of all, I must say that these two types are not concrete, and you know, many of the authors that you have already mentioned participate in both. Okay, we speak of slight tendencies, not of, you know, first of all, I have to say that in my book, I speak all the time for a Greek Western world. I mean, the dialectic between East and West is something that was important for some decades, but now we have to take a second step, in my view. And this step has to somehow realize that the convergences between the so-called East and West are also important. There are also divergences that can be understood constructively in a sense, and perhaps in a complementary way sometimes. So for me, it's important, and although I love very much Florovsky, and I've read all of his works, even when he was a student of theology. I think that that was a second step after Florovsky. That is a second step, which is not anti-Florovskian. I think that it was precisely what Florovsky had in his mind. I mean, that we have somehow to establish again a unique Christian experience with some, of course, very fair, you know, differentiations here and there. But the mainstream Christianity is important to know that it comprises not only disagreements, but also agreements. And I have great examples to give on that. I mean, for example, if you take Ignatius Scholarius, the great patriarch, you see that he tries not only to correct Aquinas through Palamas, but also he shows that in a way there are very important points where Thomas agrees with Palamas. Okay. For me, it's something that it needs to have some further discussion. But taking these two types in concreto, taking them somehow in an abstract way, because these clear forms do not absolutely exist all the time. We can say, for example, that the points that one can focus in order to see these two different metaphysics is first the concept of will. A Platonic version of it is ecstatic will. A more patristic way is the will as expression of nature. The other point is perhaps the point of contemplation. It can be participation or vision. Platonically speaking is vision, but in the patristic sense is contemplation. The other is the meaning of meaning. The meaning of meaning. I speak of the inner meaningfulness, a term that I have created in English. That I'm not a native speaker of English, and in order to show that you can create meaning together. So, excuse me, it's the opposite of the dictated meaning. That is, that one can find in the Platinian one, for example. Okay, another point is the meaning of synergy. It's clear that we have what I call an interhypostatic synergy in the patristic line, starting from Palamas, Simeon, and Maximus, Simeon, who's a Maximian father, and Palamas. the dialogical reciprocity in Maximus becomes interhypostatic synergy in Palamas. So in a more platonically inspired version of it. This is an infra-hypostatic synergy, which is narcissism. It's the self-referring subject. And the second volume of this work is precisely called the self-referring subject. I mean, you deal with the relationship within you. I'm now in relation with you, but in me. And if this happens, I hope that it's not true, but if this happens, this is clear narcissism on my part. I relate to you in myself. The meaning of history. We have historicity on the one part, and what I call mythontology, mythical ontology on the other part. This is more Platonic, mythical. We have the meaning of person-nature relationship. In a more Platonic sense, this is controlling. But in our patristic senses, this is transformation. We have the meaning of the eschata. We have either fulfilling in a patristic sense, or we have a final ecstasy of nature and history in a more Platonic sense. So we have the meaning of communion with God. In the one case is dialogue, in the other is dictation. Dictation. We don't know what to say with the God. There's a possibility of conversation between us and the one, and that's what is very, very close to it. It's the meaning of relation with God. It can be active in a Chalcedonian understanding, or passive, when you are, just under the influence of the one. So you see how, but I say again, these are tendencies. Tendencies, even in Maximus, are tendencies, prevailing tendencies. So it is, as a professor of dogmatics, it's, I find it so exciting to realize that. Despite of having a purely Christian experience in very, very first century, theology followed in her own way. It took centuries. You see, for example, to take an example, it's not the only one. In my book, I examine many of them. Nikitas Tithatos, he was the disciple of the great theologian, the great biblical theologian, the great disciple of Maximus, Simeon, the new theologian. If you read his works, you see all the time that you have to have a rational control over the passions, which is, how, where did this come from? Where it's come from? I mean, and the question is, your spiritual father spoke about this transformation. But I don't need to, as a modern man, as a psychologist, I can only smile when someone talks about a rational control upon my instincts. I can understand that it will be the transformations of grace, but the rational control. Why do we need this as a Christian argument? That's my question. Why? I mean, in what sense a Christian theologian can speak of a rational control? And this is something that God wills. If I take the rational control as something that I need, and it's something that solves my problem, what do I need the grace for? So, Christoph, that was the answer, perhaps, in this question. And I don't know.
Thank you very much. Yes, we will look at some of these point in more detail later. So at the moment, let's maybe analyze this type B self in some more detail, but because you argue in your book that the origin of nihilism and of personhood understood in terms of will to power, at least to some extent, can be traced back to Christian thinkers such as Origen and Augustine. Even if full-blown, let's say, secular Nietzschean nihilism and will to power only emerged much later in the modern era. So, Father, could you give us a brief historical overview of the history of ideas between Augustine, Origen, and Nietzschean voluntarism, because lots of things happened, obviously, between the 5th and the 19th century. So, yeah.
I'll try to do it in some minutes. Okay, it's a whole story. You see, just some points, if you allow me, just some little points that start from Augustine. And when I speak of Augustine, I speak of Origen. I truly believe that Augustine was a disciple of Origen. Now we have excellent monographies showing this. For me, that was a sort of instinct. But finally, I found some very good books describing this. Augustine read Origen in the beginning of his career. So do not blame Augustine if you want to blame someone. Both are very important. Very important. I cannot explain this. In my book, you see how I love Augustine. I write about Ron Williams's book and said, I agree with everything that he says. But at the very same moment, it's important to see the contradictions, the tensions. The pioneers of human thought have such fertile contradictions here and there. And we have to take them into account. He is the man who speaks of the free will, for example. And he thinks at the very same moment that he cannot will freely because of the sin. So he wants us to choose God in a free way, but we cannot do this. And if grace gives this us, it's not a free will anymore. And then he adds predestination. How can even the predestined can be free? And Ron Williams says this is a bitter part, forget it, just forget it. No, I like Ron Williams, but you see, these contradictions are very important, because have to do with the very essence of the problems that we are dealing with. So in a few lines, first, what comes from Augustine or Origen, or both of them, and somehow runs through the ages that came, is first faith through understanding. Okay, even Thomas Aquinas. That means faith through understanding, that somehow understanding somehow prevails. In a sense, we need faith, but we need credo ut deliquam, I believe, in order to understand. So in this sense, this is another very important element is the triadic structure of human being. You can find it even in Thomas and Bonaventure. And what is important is the hierarchic order of being, where mind, of course, prevails. We are mind. And it is important. Robert Jensen, speaking of Thomas Aquinas, speaks of his doctrine of soul as an escape soul. In a sense, soul for Aquinas needs the body. This is what I praise Aquinas in the last chapter of the book, the last of my pedicels. I praise Aquinas for this and for some other things. But of course, there are other things that I do not agree with him. So, it's important that we have grace dominating nature. But after the 13th century, as Pelikan showed, we have the opposite. We have nature somehow over grace. Okay. And of course, we have the denial of synergy. We see this also very clearly in Thomas Aquinas. Speaking of denial of synergy, that in the sense that God is an exceptional being, cannot somehow collaborate with me because I'm his servant. So he is someone who tells me what to do. This is the only way of synergy. You cannot say that this is synergy like dragging a boat, says Aquinas. Two people dragging a boat in a river. So in the sense, there's no pure dialogical synergy. And that means that will is independent, human will, because God does not take it into account. David Bradshaw, I hope he's still here, I cannot see him, is right on that point. in the sense, if you say that God takes into account human will, then in a sense, the Thomist God somehow, you know, feels dizzy. So in denial of synergy. And then we have the authors. We have Eckart's struggling divinity, which is will for self-realization in human being. We have Böhme's divine existence as a primordial hunger to emerge from nothingness. We come to Descartes. Descartes is very important for his notion of the will. Will is the foremost expression of thinking. And it's autonomous, like God, who is autonomous. And then comes, of course, this ingenious man called Schelling. God is the Ursein, the absolute will. The human will has to surrender its particularity in order to follow somehow and be identified to God's universal will. But then comes Fichte. Fichte is the one who liberated us. And he initiates this absolutization of human will against its divine counterpart. And of course, Hegel, God wills through my will. If you see my book, you will see all the references. Don't be bothered. I'm now I'm not able to show the text. Schopenhauer, and of course, then comes Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, the Augustinian Christianity is nihilistic because it renders human being transcendental. What is one of the most paradoxical events in the history of philosophy is that this man remains an Augustinian. He uses the same ecstatic notion of the will that Augustine employed. The same ecstatic notion, but he turns transcendence into an internal transcendence, as Gilles Deleuze has shown brilliantly, as internal transcendence. So in this sense, I argue, and perhaps I'm the first who argues that Nietzsche is Augustinian. Or again, Nietzsche is a Christian. Of course, he's a Christian thinker. You cannot understand Nietzsche without his Christianity. Okay. But at the very same moment, he is the one who introduces this will to power as the internal logic of a whole metaphysics, of a whole understanding of Christianity, and the correction of it, in the sense that he admits what he really has in front of his mind, in front of his eyes. And of course, he tries to somehow reorientate it concerning the real human beings and the real, history. So this is perhaps my answer. If you can accept it, I'll see that in the end of this discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your elaborate answer. So before we move on to the type A self, one more question about this tradition of Augustine and origin. And we're here in Cambridge, and in the West at least, many theologians see primarily the theological and philosophical paradigm changes that occurred in the late Middle Ages as the decisive turning point in the history of theology. So what I have in mind is the well-known rise of nominalism, voluntarism, and the transition from analogy to university of being. So what, in your view, is the significance of this period for the questions discussed in your book?
First of all, I want to say that this book, the first half of it, was written in Greek and published in 1999. Now that was translated, has been translated, and the second part is written by me in English. Yes, and I found in page 45 of this book a phrase where I say, without having read Milbank's work, that of course, the people who started all this seem to have started. This is Duns Scotus and Ockham, and they also had Tauler at Burma. But that means that I agree with this. What those people, many of them are friends of mine, close to, yeah. But I have to add also that, in a sense, there's something that seems to start much earlier. And what seems to start much earlier is precisely this understanding of will in Augustine. Ivanka, Edre von Ivanka, has argued this some decades ago, that before us, that voluntarism starts from Augustine. In my research, and anyone is able to see this, if I'm right or wrong, okay, God becomes the one, I quote a phrase in my book, God becomes the one God through the external activity of his will and his inseparable triune operation that follows. God is essentially this will or love, and this prefigures the medieval Western voluntarism. This is what I write in my book. And in the sense that means, of course, it's important to reprove this whole. I'm free to anyone who disagrees. I mean, to listen to anyone. I'm willing to change this if someone proves the opposite. So yes, that was the answer.
Thank you very much. Now it's time to move on to the second type A, self, and we have prepared here a key passage from Father Nikolaos' book, and I hope that Father Nikolaos can help us interpret this key passage. I will just upload my PowerPoint presentation so that you have this in front of you. Just a moment.
We shall be able.
Here. So that is now a key passage where Father Nikolaos gives an account of the what he understands as the Christian self, and uses a specific terminology. Yes, Father, can you help us interpret this key passage?
Oh, it will take more than half an hour. You know, this little paragraph that you have chosen comes after a long discussion of all these terms, because it's a series of terms there here which are new for the readers. An analogical pieces, poiesis of the self, the core of which, i.e. the heart of the ocean of human infinity, which imagines the divine infinities, I have argued above, the notion of natural will as will to consubstantiality. This is the patristic version of the will to power. It's the will to consubstantiality, precisely because will cannot be any more ecstatic. And there has to be an expression of nature. If will is an expression of nature, that it has to somehow unify nature, the fragmented nature. The will cannot be a will of domination or a will of internal transcendence anymore. Okay, very briefly, you have to see this in the book. I dedicate many pages to each of one of this. In a perspective of analogical or dialogical synergy ecstasis, perspective of analogical ecstasis, an ecstasy that somehow discusses. I use the term analogy here always in the Areopagitic sense of synergy, or the Maximian sense of dialogue. So analogy means dialogue or synergy, which as the hypostatic energy unifies human desire, and then the fragmented and the created nature in analogy with the divine consubstantiality, leading to the intermeaningfulness of God's kingdom, which starts as ecclesial interlegality already now. So if I sorry if I'm asking you to forgive Christoph for changing this difficult paragraph, but in the book, all these things are explained. I'm trying to explain all these things in new terms. So we perhaps can see this. I don't know if Christoph has already this in his mind, in the perspective of this discussing, but the modern divided self. You can see how these things can apply to the modern divided self. I call it divided self. I don't know if this is what you have in mind, Christoph.
That's right.
So in this sense, we can say somehow how all these things apply to modern problems and why this is important for us to use them, because as Christoph has explained already, the book seems to be historical, but it is a systematic book. Okay, it tries to solve actual problems. So modern philosophy is haunted, by I call it divided self. And this is body, spirit, senses, intellect, desire, will, and reason, inwardness, exteriority, sex, affection, ego, unconscious, faith, reason, some of the pairs, these dialectic oppositions. Good. So it has taken this from page 2 to 5. Good. So speaking of the first, for example, this opposition, in page 259, I write explicitly that the person is psychosomatic. We do not have the person as mainly the soul, as we see it in the Platonic tradition and even in Augustine and Origen. Concerning the second pair, senses, intellect, it is important. This is called, in my list of page 259, embodied consciousness. It is important to understand, and this comes from this biblical trend, that the intellect does not exist without the senses. Not only that it does not function without senses, but it does not exist without senses. It cannot exist without the body. All of the concepts that we have in our minds are constructed through somatic bodily metaphors. It's important. In this sense, there's no human intellect without the body. Even the fact that we can see each other this moment, it's not caused by our souls, but our two eyes, what we call two eyes vision in the neuroscience. So in this sense, our consciousness is decisively embodied. And this is why any salvation which somehow leaves behind our bodily existence is no true salvation. This is why the resurrection of the bodies we believe in is the only possible way to say that salvation is something that refers to us. Otherwise, we have just streams of consciousness, parallel streams of consciousness, without any possibility of personal differentiation or personal identity. So, desire, will, and reason. This is another dialectic which has to be overcome. Desire is the reason of nature. This is most important. It's not desire that has to be in a Platonic or Aristotelian or Origenian way controlled by the reason. Desire is the intrinsic reason, nature, the will, and somehow it is after this that we can think of it. Okay, if we try to think of nature without desire, that means that what we have, what we take finally, is what Maximus called the collovosis of nature. Collovosis is to cut, to make it a creeper, to cut foot, cut fingers, cut, hands, have a part, just what is the most, perhaps, noble part. And then we take the inwardness, the exteriority. In this perspective, we understand that inwardness is verified through exteriority, and vice versa. This is very important because in all the European tradition of the subjectivity, at the exception of Lacan only, I was a Lacanian when I was a psychologist. Perhaps I still like some parts of this. And I've written some texts on this, Maximus and Lacan, for example. But in Maximus and Simeon and Lacan, another one, Simeon the theologian, on desire, on Lacan. It is very important to understand that speaking of this inwardness, it is important somehow to verify it also externally. If you read Husserl, you see that everything comes to my horizon and everything, I'm in communion with you. And this is very close to what modern psychology says about narcissism. I have everything that I need of you in my personal consciousness, but I do not have you. Heinz Kocher would say, a psychologist that I liked very much, you're here as self-objects of mine, without hyphen, self-objects. That means that somehow you are objects of my narcissism. I do not love you. I do not like you. I don't give a penny for you. Perhaps you do the same for me. If you think of me that I'm important, the fact that you are here, that I'm important, can be also treated in the same narcissistic way. That means we desperately need an ontology of the other, of the other's otherness. That was one of my disagreements with my mentor, Zizoulas, and all the ecstaticism, of course. Zizoulas thought that I was a bad guy because I do not like this ecstaticism, but I cannot cope with it if I want to stay close to this patristic line. The other is sex and affection. Okay, I have nothing to say about this. So everything knows that it's impossible to put these things together in our times because of this split between body and spirit again. Of course, we don't understand that sex, as Freud has perhaps understood, first of all, that has not to do with sex, sexual intercourse. It's something that starts much before and extends much beyond. Okay, the ego is unconscious. Ego is unconscious. That was another of Freudian discoveries, and that is true. What we call ego is a series of projects, what we imagine that we are. That means that the unconscious has to be discovered, and we have to listen to it. This is why I express with saying that human nature is in becoming. In becoming because it has to learn from himself, from within, and from the others. And then faith, reason. Okay, faith is God's reason, the way God sees man. Okay, in this perspective, faith has to do with communion. Okay, so I think that we can stop with this question here, dear Christoph.
Okay.
Christoph has posed excellent questions. I mean, I congratulate him on that. I am, so impressed with all this. He forces me to rethink the whole book, in a sense, a great part of it. So yes, please.
Okay, shall we move on, or Father Nikolaos, or shall we have our break now, or shall we continue with the last questions?
No, it is important to continue with the discussion.
Okay.
You have it in your mind. I'll try to be a little more, yes.
Okay, let's continue. Father Nikolaos put together a very helpful table in the book. See on page 259.
No, not only that. I mean, this is can be left in for the end. Let's leave it. You said that you have to somehow discuss about the Greek Western world. That was one of your questions. After
yes, let's move on. Okay,
we have talked about this already.
All right, fine. Yeah, let's move on then. That's fine. I'll stop here the PowerPoint presentation. Yes, so let's talk about the ecumenical dimension or aspect of your book. Yeah,
this is important for me.
Yeah, your book clearly makes a significant contribution to the ecumenical dialogue. This becomes manifest particularly in part 3, where you emphasize, you mentioned this today as well, that the comparison between the A and the A and the B type of the self had nothing to do with a clearly delineated East-West dialectic. That would be an oversimplification. So you often talk about the Greek Western world, which comprises both, the Latin West and the Greek East. So you argue that both types can be found in the Greek East as well as in the Latin West, even if the A type is certainly more prominent in the Orthodox tradition. So Father, can you tell us how your typology is received by Western scholars? So you often talk in the West, you attend conferences in the West, you talk to Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant theologians. So what is their reaction? How do they receive
look,
your theory?
Because of the coronavirus, the book reached the book. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, because of the coronavirus, the book reached most of its recipients. It was said both by me and the publisher after many months. It took months to take the book. So I had some reactions, positive reactions, very recently. Some of them took the book only last December. Some are still waiting for it. So in this sense, because of all this, I didn't have, but I had some first good reactions. It's not an easy book. I think that somehow one has to think about it. Now, but what is very important to me is to answer this question about the modern and the contemporary situation. Let me show my last book in Greek. You will not understand the title, published last July. You will see, you will understand the image. It is The Open History and Its Enemies, the rise of the velvet totalitarianism. You can see this, okay? The rise of the velvet. It's been translated by Norman Russell in English, so it will appear in English. I'm trying here to make a philosophical-theological analysis of enlightenment and the post-enlightenment period, and reach the modern political philosophy and the modern understanding of the self, and finally speak of the mytho-technological metahuman metaphysics. This is something that we have to face together. What comes is very important. Now we have an ecclesia here, an e-church here, we're together, but at the very same moment, it is a sort of metahumanism, which is somehow can become our worst possibility of selfhood. In a sense, what is pleasure, this principle of pleasure and classical psychoanalysis, and the principle of reality. The principle of reality is absolutely expelled, abandoned, and through this new technology, we can have everything that we desire not in dialogue with God, but absolutely narcissistically, in with our, in all these equipments that we have been invented, and leave, escape. This is the final revenge of Platonism, escape reality, absolutely. Okay, without being, anyhow, in any way obliged to return to it. You understand what I'm talking about? This myth of technological, digital humanism, which humanity, meta-humanity that comes. So it is important to find new anthropological data in our traditions, or in our tradition, in order to cope with very difficult anthropological issues that are absolutely, important. In front of us. This is why I honestly believe that we have to enforce this dialogue within this Greek Western world that we are. And somehow create new terms. This is what I'm trying to do, new ways of understanding personality. I want just in parentheses to say that all the terms that I have invented in order to describe the experience of selfhood, I think there are about 10, are all of them in dialogue with some concrete problems, philosophies, and psychological trends or sociological understandings. So my impression is that we have to work in this sound way ecumenically. That does not mean that each one of us does not retain its identity. Okay. No, it's not a salad, it's not a melting pot. I have to give, and I have perhaps to take. This open mind, this esprit large, if you like, in French, it's what we are obliged to somehow show. Yeah. Yes, Christoph.
Thank you very much. So let's return to the Orthodox tradition. So in your book, Genealogy and History of Ideas obviously play an important role. But in the first place, you are addressing contemporary philosophical and theological questions. In other words, we find in your book a very creative reinterpretation, or perhaps even development of patristic theology. So what is your understanding of church tradition, and how are we to think of the interplay between tradition and innovation?
Oh, thank you. That's a very good question. I'm asked this question many times. Tradition for me, in its genuine form, tradition, there are some Greeks in our audience. Tradition comes from, it's the same verb in Greek with the verb surrender. Paradidome, paradosis, paradidome. I surrender myself. Tradition is what you surrender yourself to what is very important. This is tradition. That means tradition is always new. Tradition has to do with my surrender to the essentials. Tradition is the continuity that somehow makes us sure that it's the same spirit in the church working. And we have to deal with this in that way. So if we leave this apart, we have horrible things as what was called recently meta-patristic theology. I don't understand what's meta-patristic theology. I'm unable to understand it even literally. Why do I need? Maximus lived some centuries ago, but somehow he is always important because he's fertile. Plato is fertile. We're not Platonists, but Plato is alive. And the other tendency is a sort of neoconservatism. Okay, and so another thing that I have to stress concerning this, it's that we do not have to defend tradition. The fathers did not defend tradition. They made something which is much more important. They tried to show us why a certain tradition was the tradition of the church. Why a certain tradition was worth becoming tradition of the church. Because all the heresies, all the deviations, claim that were traditional. All of them. If I speak as a professional dogmatologist, all the great heretics said that I am the tradition. I am the tradition. The importance of a man like Maximus was that he showed why this tradition, concrete tradition of diotheletism, for example, was worth becoming the tradition of the church, was the real tradition of the church. You see, not because he wanted to defend tradition, but because he somehow reworked, understood it again within himself and existentially, both existentially and intellectually. In this way, tradition is something which is absolutely, alive, but only if someone is not conservative. If he is conservative, that tradition is dead.
Thank you.
Conservative in this bad sense that he wants to defend something because it is old, because it's given, because it comes from the past. No. Tradition is worth becoming tradition still now. And this is something we have to surrender ourselves to the essentials that lie beyond or behind this tradition in order to rediscover this here for us again. So, this is the...
Thank you very much. Now, the last question for Nicholas. We didn't have much time to discuss it, but in your book, you also engage with a number of modern and postmodern philosophers.
Yeah.
So the question is, where do you see the main points of contact between your understanding of the Christian self and postmodern philosophy, or at least certain strands of postmodern philosophy? Yeah, a number of philosophers you're discussing, like Levinas, Ricoeur, Nietzsche, Merleau-Ponty. So how is your approach to the Christian self related to these major thinkers?
Look, it is found on page 267 of the book, where I try to present in summary 12 characteristics, 12 of this new self, of this sort of self, yes, which is old, but it's new. So it will take some time to somehow develop this, but very briefly, I can just offer some of the characteristics in dialogue with postmodern philosophy, of course. For example, the body as a locus of the salvation of natural world. The self-creation, but in participation, because philosophical autonomy is always bad with necessity. The analogical autonomy in and through participation. Analogical autonomy. What I call intra-co-being. This is developed in the second volume. To change the will for myself to a will for the other at the same time. To understand that so much communion, that much self-knowledge. That's the fourth characteristic. I'm reading now my book. The psychological, to connect psychological with the ontological. that in the realization of human being and not just a fantasy of, balance. What I said already, I called in the meaningfulness. Meaningfulness, to give meaning together. To give meaning together. This is anti-narcissistic meaningfulness. Okay. The understanding of self as continuing revelation. In another one, yes. A question of meaning in everything that we do here in Hikanunk. That's some of the characteristics that through which we can cope with some analogous questions coming from postmodern philosophy. And I do believe that this is an ongoing discussion. Okay. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. It's probably time to draw this first part of our conversation to a close.
For your patience, for your...
Yes, thank you for your patience. I think the idea is now to have a short break, let's say until 6:25. And if you have questions, then Father Nikolaos is happy to take your questions. And
what time did you say, Christoph?
Maybe a short break until 6:25. So that's almost 6:25. And then Father Nikolaos will take questions.
I have time here, so...
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
Okay, Father, maybe we start. Some people have just turned off the camera. I know we can still start. First, I don't forget to mention it. So Rosvan has circulated the order form in the chat box. So if you'd like to download this, you can do this now. And for the questions, because we're quite a large group, it's probably easiest if you indicate in the chat box that you would like to ask a question. You don't need to write the question in the chat box. Just indicate that you have a question, and then we can take the questions in turn. Yeah. First, Father Andreas Andropoulos would like to say something. And I think it's now almost past. I think we can start. Father Andreas. You have to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Well, thank you, Father Nikolaos, for the wonderful presentation. I don't have a question. I just would like to express the joy of the publisher and the editors of the series. As of course you know, and some people may know, I'm a member of the editorial board for the series Traditionis Theologia, and I think that you're a wonderful addition to this series and to this kind of scholarship. Something that I'd like to say about Father Nikolaos, and I say it in every occasion, and this is a very suitable occasion, is that he's one of the, unfortunately, still relatively very few Orthodox theologians from the old country who does not behave only as an Orthodox theologian, but who witnesses and he deposits his thoughts, his contribution to the wider field of theology. That's a very valuable perspective that we see in this book and many of the books that Father Nikolaos has given us. It's a very much needed voice in not just among ourselves, because if we just kept it as a voice of one Orthodox among many Orthodox, it would simply be an affair of an exotic group out there. Father Nikolaos' contribution is certainly not. It's relevant to the wider context of modern theological and philosophical thought today, and I would like to thank him very much for this on behalf of the editors and the publishers. This was what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father Andreas. Now we have a question. We have lots of questions from Stoyan, the first. Please. please unmute your microphone.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have a question, but before I just wanted to start with a statement, because Georgi Kapriev, who is a professor of philosophy in Sofia, wrote a review of the book, of which I helped him to translate and submit to St. Vladimir's. Just wanted to read the first sentence of this, because Kapriev is not able to participate tonight, but I cannot resist quoting the first statement, where he says that I should start by saying openly, this is one of the most important books of our time that I have read in the interdisciplinary field of theology, philosophy, and culturology. It is crucial for our culture, both Orthodox and European culture in general. So I'll not say more, just wanted to say this because Kapriev is not here, and you know, I had a chance to talk to him this morning. And in kind of supporting this statement, I just wanted to ask or to point one thing that I appreciated in this book. I have it for a couple of months now, and this is the explicit theological link between Saint Maximus, Saint Simeon the New Theologian, and Saint Gregory Palamas. So my question is, in a few words, Father Nikolaos, just to comment on this particular link from a theological point of view.
For Nicholas, you must unmute yourself.
Okay, good. Now, thank you very much, Stoyan. Thank you very much. And yes, Professor Kapriev wrote a very, very, very important review of the book. I think that these, not only these, but mainly these authors form a sort of axis, okay, that permits us somehow to speak of a new anthropology, which is a biblical anthropology. None of them is Platonic, none of them is Aristotelian, none of them is Stoic, none of them is, say, whatever. They have studied all of these sources, not Simeon, but Maximus, and of course Palamas. They are both not Western, or they are the Western, you know, they in somehow, I try to prove, I'm trying to prove that Palamas is important also for the West, the so-called West. His anthropology is very, very, very advanced. I just, you know, presented some glimpses of this, what I call, for example, intersubjective synergy, solved for me the problem which forced me to abandon psychology. Because to abandon, I mean, the practice of psychology. I am a psychologist, but I could not solve the problem of narcissism. You know, there are two main problems that psychoanalysis, psychotherapy will never be able to solve, at least two. The first is what to do with narcissism. We need it desperately. This is the oxygen of our souls. And this is the venom also. This is what kills us. So how can we use this monster, which is narcissism? And this monster has not, this problem, it has not been solved so far. In European philosophy, both philosophy and psychology, we speak all the time about either subjectivity. But what sort of either subjectivity? You know, even if you see Thomas Aquinas, he speaks of a relationship, but a relationship, God relates to man, but inside himself. So I said, I relate at this moment with all of you inside me. Narcissism is a form of relation, not the opposite. The most common form of relationship, which is explicitly sadomasochistic, not in the sexual dimension of it, but in the existential sense. So, and this problem is solved by Maximus with his dialogical reciprocity, but even better by Gregory Palamas with this notion that I call intersubjective. I'm giving example at this moment, intersubjective synenergy. That means that every moment of our existence is a moment of synergy, even when we are thinking of ourselves and in ourselves, or turning ourselves, the others are present, actively present. And there is only one man who realized it outside theology, and that was Jacques Lacan. But he realized it as a barrier, something that cannot be achieved. You know, because if I melt with the other, this is what is paranoia. If I deny the other, I objectify the other. He realized that I'm condemned. My desire is the desire of another, always. But he cannot say, how can I become myself without cutting this bond, cutting this knot, cutting this, okay, Gordian knot. Okay, so I'm giving just an example. There are many others. For example, in relation with Wittgenstein. Okay, Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein is another tragic thinker of our times, tragic because he understood that he was wrong. And he corrected himself. And he corrected him in a way that he shows that shows us this way, shows that the problem is unsolved. How can we create meaning somehow which is valid in both ways? I mean, from me to you and from you to me, and that how this is, but if you read Maximus, you will realize that this can't be done. This is the only way. This is what I call intermeaningful. I spoke about this 2 times before. There are 10 such terms, at least 10. Many others can perhaps discover other terms and other ways of relating with it. Either meaningfulness in the sense that any meaning is valid while and when is somehow is made through this real otherness of the real other. Okay. Another paradigm is what we call the we-less I. It's called we-less I by Norbert Elias, a man who died in England. When I was in England, he was very aged. The we-less I is the most recent development in the Western self-consciousness, the sociological self-consciousness. We-less I, how can we have this we-less I without the I or without the we? I mean, how can we have both things together, I and we? Elias thinks that has been lost for centuries in the Western world. There is another problem. What, for example, Milbank Taylor calls analogical analogy. The question: what sort of analogy can we have? Is it a dictated analogy? I mean, we have the supreme being that dictates my existence, and somehow I accept this with gratitude, but you know, there's no way for me somehow to get rid of this as a burden of, you know, superb, you know, ontologicals. You know, if we remove this energy toward the Areopagite synergy, we understand analogy in another way. I'm not just in analogical existence. I'm in a constant discussion with God. God does not impose, and I'm not just a passive being before him. He gives me ways, and he is very patient, and he's a poet, and he writes a poem with me. You know, there are no poem which is not written by at least two persons. This is why I say that there are poets who write and poets who read, but they're both poets. Okay, so but I'm just giving there are more paradigms that show how important it is to somehow understand all these great theologians who, at the very same moment, saved the participation in God and human existence. You can read, for example, Simeon, the theologian, how much he insists, this poet, he was a poet, that I am my body, and I am, and my body is Christ. I move my hand, and Christ is this hand. I move my body, Christ is this body. And says, I do not need to change my soul into body or body into soul, because he has received anything. He has taken everything. He's in everything. You see, and in this sense, it's absolutely realistic. He was asked, how can we understand God? Through mind, by his opponents. No, as a pregnant woman, he answered, feels the baby in her womb. I have absolutely postmodern answer. And very secularly sound. You know, no projections, not, you know, much imagination, no narcissism at all. Plotinus would be dead if someone who said that the one is, you know, kicking in my like this. No, this is not the one. This is not one, but he imagined that the one was what he has in his narcissistic imagination. Plotinus is wonderful, it's very sweet and very dangerous. Very sweet and very dangerous. So I don't know, Stoyan, if I answer to your question, but for me, this is an axis which saves in Chalcedon, this union of the two natures in that way, without turning, without changing to each other, without being confused with, you know, and shows at the very same moment the affirmation of nature made through the incarnation, and second, the possibility of this nature, not of a person, which is freedom, and nature is necessity. No, there is no necessity in nature, because it is assumed by grace. This is why Maximus says, «Ουχ είναι αγκασμένα εισήν τα των λογικών φυσικάς». Very strange for any Platonist phrase, or even Aristotelian. The attributes of the logical beings, the natural attributes, do not imply necessity, which is very strange. This is why criticism to my mentors, again, Erasmus, I don't know if they understood, but I mean, clearly, but the problem is that you cannot either possess your nature, as you have said in answering to possess. You don't possess. Nature is a monster. You have an unconscious behind. You have to find ways through grace to descend to this and, you know, bring light into this darkness. Everyone who thinks that he possesses his nature, he can become a neurotic or a psychotic. So, but these are the three theologians of this great in the Holy Spirit, great balance. You have everything which is human and natural, but at the very same moment, this nature, as Maximus says, can be ενεργή και ενεργείται υπέρ των αυτής θεσμών, can be energized or can act beyond its limits. This is the Chalcedon. This is the Fourth Ecumenical Council. Thank you for this question.
Okay, thank you for that. For next question, yeah, Jason, please, could you please ask your question? We can't hear you at the moment.
And we can't see him.
We can't see you, Jason. Maybe, oh, you have to unmute.
Yes, no, yeah, I see him. Please unmute, yes.
Yeah, it's working now. It just wouldn't let me unmute. Thank you, Father Nikolaos, for your book and for this presentation. Actually, Dr. Stoyan actually anticipated some of my question. I'm working with Dr. Stoyan at St. Paul University in Ottawa on my PhD thesis on Simeon and repentance. And so I wanted to ask a couple of maybe brief questions. What would you say specifically is the link between, say, just Simeon and Maximus? Because you speak of Maximus, his theology of the will, and Simeon's understanding of repentance. It was for each chapter. So what would you characterize would be a link between these two, Maximus and Simeon, and also the issue of repentance in Simeon? Why is it so important? Why do you think it's repentance is so important for Simeon? And then maybe just quick side question. You use the term consubstantiality of being a lot in the book. You use that term a lot, and I just wanted for my own self, when I go back and read and reread, what exactly do you mean when you say that? Like, what does consubstantiality of being mean? So I just want to make sure that I'm clear on that when I go back and I reread the book.
Thank you. I start from the second question. Consubstantiality, it's something that I have, it's one of my, of the terms that I have put in use, over the last years, and I'm asked by many. I speak of Ecclesiology of Consubstantiality, of the will to consubstantiality. I owe this inspiration mainly to Maximus. Maximus is the one who spoke explicitly about this possibility of transmitting the Trinitarian consubstantiality to creation through Christ. This is a Christological consubstantiality. And he created a whole ecclesiology based upon this. Anyone who reads my book, published with St. Vladimir's The Church in the Making, and along with the excellent review as an introduction, written by Father Maximus Constus from the Holy Cross, in number 6, volume number 6 of the Analogia. We'll see that, that this is a concept both anthropological and ecclesiological. Ecclesiological in the sense that what is given to the church by the God is what he does himself to unify everything till the point that everything becomes one. Not in the sense that their different essences are abolished, but in the sense that they become one creation, one being, one. And on the ecclesiological field, Maximus, following the Areopagite, and it's very important to see this connection between Areopagite and Maximus. The same thing that Maximus takes a step beyond as both geniuses, and absolutely. In that point, precisely, Maximus tries to explain what is a charisma, the theology of charisma, initiated by the Areopagite. For the Areopagite, each charisma is a process of participation directly in God and distribution at the very same moment. Maximus takes this and explains this through his understanding of consubstantiality. That means that each charisma, its gift, its charisma. You know the Greek word charisma, charism, is a way of unification, is direct participation in the unifying energy of God, and at the very same moment, a way of unifying all things. All charismata, ecclesial charismata, are like this: participation in what? In the unifying energy of God, and at the very moment, unification actively, they receive and they give unification to all beings. And this is called Ecclesiology of Consubstantiality, and it has to be understood someday. I participate, I'm still a member of the academic dialogue with our Roman Catholic brothers, but I'm trying to make them understand this very crucial point that somehow church communion has to be at the very same moment an ontological event, and not just something imposed from above by one who is, say, the Pope, principal, the colonel, the field marshal, I don't know. You understand? And consubstantiality is also an anthropological data given in the sense that this is what you're trying to do. When you realize that nature is given by God, you realize also that it's fragmented, divided, because of many opinions, many personal choices. So what God wants you to do is to unify this, imitating Christ. So again, we have consubstantiality on the anthropological level. So you see that anthropology and ecclesiology are absolutely connected. And this is precisely the line that started from Macarius of Egypt. In the sense that asceticism, is this interiority, this, how is the word? Asceticism is ecclesiology that becomes somehow existential. I wrote this in this book also. Hesychasm, I say, it's ecclesiology lived out. You become ecclesia, in a sense. You become ecclesia. And the ecclesia is both external and internal. The one verifies the other. You see, and now, what is the link? I hope that your research will shed new light. But first of all, it's the natural will. The natural will in the sense that we have to fulfill our nature in Christ. I mean, we become what we are. We become what we really are. We become what we really, God wants us to become. You see, briefly. There are other links also, but we'll perhaps talk it in private if you send me an email. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you too.
There's another question. I think that's Alexander. Yes, I think I've unmuted you.
I cannot see. I cannot see him.
Yeah, I actually, I don't think that was me.
Oh, I see. There is an Alex who has a question, but I can't find him. Maybe Alex has left in the meantime. I don't know. Could you reveal yourself, please? So I think Alex is no longer present. But please let, oh, Alex, here. Is this Alex? All right. Yes, here. Okay. I've unmuted you. Sorry, I didn't recognize you. Yeah. Please. You can ask your question now. Alex? Hello, Alex, you can ask your question.
Perhaps he changed his mind.
He is still here.
He is still here.
He is. Okay, then we take the next question first, and we'll go to Katerina.
Katerina Daniel.
Katerina Daniel. Here. Yeah.
Are you Greek?
I'm Greek, yes, hello. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Yes. I think maybe Alex may have problems with the unmuting because I had a little problem. I'm not sure. Okay, so hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very nice, and I'm getting familiar with your work, Father. So it's been great. Just a little bit, a very simple question, and I'm sorry if it's too simple, but I was just want to ask you. I suppose you said something a little bit about narcissism and being a Lacanian psychoanalyst before, and I was just wondering, because I've been also very much in line with same interests a little bit, but I do have to say, I have to a little bit to disclose to you, I feel a little bit guilty sometimes, because I think Lacanian psychoanalysis has its own kind of ways of thinking. Yeah, it has its own ways of thinking in terms of the practice of it, how it collapses kind of the narcissistic, what you're saying, and kind of collapses all the identifications, kind of phallic identifications and all that in a very, very different ways, where we find in theology, through the transformations and the ascesis, has a very, very different practice and very different ways of thinking and consciousness, I suppose. So just a very simple question, just because you, I just wanted to ask you, just because you said that you were an analyst before as well, how do you compromise this now? How do you consolidate, and compromise, so how do you consolidate your previous kind of analytical thinking and practice with a theological when it comes to understand or help others, I suppose? You know, how do you consolidate those two, the theological terms with the very analytical, which has its own mindset and own kind of function, I suppose? If you have any thoughts on that. I personally feel, I'm a psychologist myself, and I feel a little bit guilty to try to do any consolidation of this a little bit, but I've been driven somehow intuitively, and so I was wondering, how did you come about to shift and to consolidate those two?
I analyze my colleagues. I create files, psychological files for colleagues and students. No, look, psychoanalysis is not kind. It's not kind at all. And in order to understand it, you have to understand how wrong was a great part of European philosophy, and how much this European philosophy neglected life, the real life. So, in a sense, psychoanalysis is the opposite of the idealism. I have written texts on psychoanalysis. Two of them are going to be incorporated in the next issue of Analogia, which is dedicated with the help of Dr. Stoyan Stanev. And it will be a very interesting double volume dedicated to Orthodox theology and science. And I have two essays on psychoanalysis and the roots, the theological roots of psychoanalysis. And of course, there's a book I'm trying to write on the theological roots of the unconscious. But in the everyday life, it can be combined, but with love, my dear colleague, with love. You have to love the other. What theology adds is the adoption, the eschatological dimension, that the fact that this man or this woman is a son of God or a daughter of God, you know. So you approach him through his future, through his, what can become, you know. Psychoanalysis is protological. It is also eschatological. One of my essays says that although Freud was atheist, in the essays that could be published in Analogia, it's an old translated from Greek, says that psychoanalysis is clearly biblical. He tries to help you become what you want to be. Has this, but in the theological sense, this horizon is much broader. So this man that you have in front of you is someone that God likes to dwell in him, you know. It makes him his son or his daughter or his whatever. So if you use psychology in this perspective, then it will be a tool for new discoveries. But the solutions, the existential solution, it's got to be theological. You understand? If you're trying to give just psychological solutions, you will be confused. you will confuse the others. You will become rich at the very same moment, but the results will be. It's very important to have this combination, but it is first of all a question of internal ascetics that you have to follow. Okay, so thank you for this question.
Thank you. I think two more questions further. In the meantime, Alex has posted this question in the chat box. I think everyone can see it, but I'm going to read it. He writes, if Greek patristic theology strives to overcome unhealthy dichotomies that are present in the West since Augustine, is creating another dividing typology, other type A and B in your book, really going to bring about an integrative view of selves as a social reality? In other words, do we have another way of falling into a narcissistic trap of trying to belong with the winners?
I don't think that I understood the last meaning of the last phrase. What are the winners?
Yeah, Alex, can you elaborate on your question? I have unmuted you. Okay, that doesn't seem to work.
And I didn't get the first 3 or 4 words of what you read, because yes.
Or you can read it in the chat box, Father. It's.
What is the chat box? I have nothing in front of me now.
Oh, at the bottom, chat.
Let me.
Yeah. So this is the at the bottom. It's the second last question.
Let me see. How would for the current situation, especially in Greece, where locked down for a year?
The last one.
In Greek patristic theology, Alex, Yes, Milikos. If Greek patristic theology strives to overcome unhealthy dichotomies that are present in the West since Augustine, I never said that these dichotomies are present in the West. I say that these dichotomies are present also in the East, through Origen. In my book, I speak of Origenian interpretation of Hesychasm, of Nietzschean. There is a chapter called Nietzschean interpretations of Hesychasm. Look at this, which is, for me, utterly important. Let me see. Nietzschean readings of Hesychasm. Page, yes, at the beginning. Nietzschean readings of Hesychasm. It's very important. We have to find Hesychasm. You know, the Orthodox people, or the Orthodox, some monasteries, and they don't know what practice Hesychasm, but theology has times, you know, absolutely misunderstood Hesychasm. It understands this in a Nietzschean way. And, you know, they disdain the ecclesial mysteries, just like Origen did. Okay, they feel proud of themselves as they are, you know, the kings of the world, and because they have this sort of spiritual transcendence. Hesychasm is not transcendence at all. Hesychasm is the opposite, to set your mind inside the body, inside yourself, but in communion with others. Unhealthy dichotomies that are present in the West, since Augustine, both in the East and West, is creating, while striving perhaps to overcome, is creating another dividing typology, A and B in your book. Oh no, really going to bring about integrative view of self as a social reality. In other words, do we have another way of falling into narcissistic trap of trying to belong with the winners? Ah, now understood. No, we're not the winners, we're the losers, dear friend. Because what we have has not been yet understood properly. Yes, this is what I claim. And I insist, I do not create, of course, this friend has not read the book of man. If you read the book, you will see that we have an interpenetration of all these characteristics, even in Augustine, even in Thomas Aquinas, even, it's not a clear-cut statement like this. You have here, the West, the type of analogy, here in this, the type of inwardness. No. Christoph, who has the book, Christoph, who has read the book, knows that I'm not talking like this. But I say that theoretically speaking, there is a tendency in the mature Greek tradition only toward that direction, not without, at the very same moment, influences from the other. Even in Maximus, I said clearly, you can see elements that you see in common with Augustine. But, for example, the concept of the will is different. For Maximus, it's not transcendent. For Augustine, it's clearly transcendent. You see? But in other points, Augustine seems to be Maximian. And of course, Aquinas, who has a theory of the body concerning the bodily existence, which is very close to Maximus. Yeah, indeed. Let's be careful. I mean what I say, that you have to broaden our horizons in order not to be just polemic, because many Catholics and many Protestants are polemic in the same way. For example, you see this in Gregory Palamas. They reject him because of what I call cultural wars. Cultural wars. They reject him. They cannot understand. They say silly things about him. I have never met yet. I have not met yet one Western scholar who knows Palamas and rejects him because he knows him. They all said terrible things about Palamas, which have nothing to do with Palamas himself. That he invented henads, he has creatures between him and God, He has, you know, he rejects the body, he rejects civilization, he rejects history, he is, and absolutely wrong. They have not understood. Why? Because of these cultural wars. And we do the same. And we do the same. You know, it was a very bad, sad surprise when I realized I was a U.S. assistant for years. I realized that all the generation of the 60s have never read indeed Augustine and Aquinas. Yes, I include Romanidis, who was also my teacher, one of my teachers, Yanaras, and Julius. They never read. I mean, starting from the first volume and then with the last, this is what is reading. So they said things that they have taken from different authors, different sources, and this precisely the same happened on the other part, on the other side, and still happens. And they create monsters, they create caricatures one of the other. This has to stop. If this does not stop on both parts, we have both losers, not winners. So, Alex says, thank you to me. Thank you too, Alex.
Good. Yes.
So Benjamin Morris says he has a question.
No, there's someone else who was first thought. I think we have to draw this to a close. But the last question is from Panayotis, and she posted a question also in the chat box. I'm going to read it. It's about the situation in Greece. How would Father Loudovikos comment on the current situation, especially in Greece, where there's been a lockdown for a year? It seems like what Giorgio Agamben described as naked life has become a new Platonic anthropology, where we define ourselves with something that's constantly under threat by physis. Thus, the negation of every form of interaction with the other becomes something like salvation.
Good, I like it.
Question, yeah, good question.
We have to save ourselves from the other. This is what Schopenhauer said. We have to help themselves. And of course, this is a sort of Stoicism. You just see what you have in your yard, what you have in your heart, and leave everything outside. Yes, it is a sort of transcendentalism, but no one is ready to admit it. Not only in Greece. This happens everywhere. And I think that Agamben is very right when he speaks of naked life. In a sense, we need a life that is life. Just biological life. And this is why our church is closed, our churches are closed, our universities are closed, everything is closed, and everything, just waits for the vaccination. The good thing is that we can finish books, so that it was impossible to do this before. Yeah. Is there any question?
I think it's time to stop. I think
I see a lady in front of me called Jasmine, and I want to ask if it is a Greek name.
Okay.
Not a Greek name. It's not a Greek name. I cannot hear you. Yeah, because it is also a Greek name. Yeah, indeed. I cannot. You have to unmute you in order to hear. I cannot hear you. There are many, and yes, also some others who are Greek here. Yeah.
Just a moment, Jasmine. Just a moment.
Hello.
Yeah, you're not Greek.
I am actually Russian and Romanian, but I'm Romanian and Russian. Yeah, I am.
That was my only question. So,
okay. Thank you.
Have we finished now?
Yes, I think it's time to draw this conversation to a close. Would like to thank Father Nikolaos for his presentation and for answering all these questions. And of course, also the audience for asking excellent questions. I hope you enjoyed the evening and that you will order and study Father Nikolaos's book, of course. This conversation, of course, without the discussion after, will be available online, I think, Roswan, sometime in the future.
I was waiting for a good question by David, Professor David Bradshaw, but he spared me. He showed mercy. I want to ask you, dear David, have you received the book or not? Have you the book? Do you have the book? Unmute him, please.
I have.
You have it. So.
Yes, here it is.
You can write to me whatever you like. I'm always listening to you with much care, you know this.
Well, I have not read it yet, but I'm looking forward to it very much. And I know I'm going to learn a lot just from what you said today. It's going to be fascinating.
And I'm learning from you. Okay, thank you. All the best to all. Thank you for your patience and for your goodwill.
Yeah, thank you, Father. It was great.
Thank you too. Bye.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And have a good night and see you hopefully again soon. In
Greece, everything is closed now. We cannot open the door and get out. It's 9 o'clock. I don't know, it's 9:17. So we are locked in. Yeah.
I see.
All the best to you who can walk for a while.